Hey, welcome to Capturing Christianity. I'm Cameron Bertuzzi. Today we're talking about something we haven't actually addressed on the channel before. It's called the boring heaven objection. I've got some really exciting stuff for you today in the show, so if you stick around, you'll be able to see we've got a clip lined up from Dr. Shelley Keegan and Dr. I think he's got a doctorate,
Yeah.
N.T. Wright. Yeah, I just never actually hear people say Dr. Wright. Maybe it's just me. Maybe that's just an idiosyncratic thing about me. But he does have a doctorate. Thank you, Jimmy. But I've got Jimmy on with me to address this sort of objection, which we're actually going to spend a little bit of time at the very beginning of this show, just kind of spelling out like what this objection kind of looks like. Because in my study of this objection and in hearing it from atheists and skeptics and stuff, it doesn't really seem like this is a very fleshed out objection. At least like there's not really articles that are written on this or books that are written on this objection. It's just something that you kind of hear every now and then. And the objection is basically that heaven doesn't really seem like something that would be worth it, like forever. Okay, so like maybe you would want to live in some kind of like blissful state for a period of time, but eventually boredom would set in. You'd run out of things to do. Maybe you just like over time, like sitting there for millions and millions of years, like you'd get just tired of like the same thing over and over and over, even if that thing was super good. And there are some like parallels you could bring in from like life here on Earth. So like sometimes when you experience a good thing too much, then it becomes a bad thing. But Jimmy, I kind of want to turn things over to you and get your help to kind of lay out what this objection, like the way that you've heard it expressed before, and then maybe like a way that we can steelman the objection, because what we don't want to do is like waste our time, waste you guys' time, and just like not address something that's even worth addressing. And like I said, we do have a clip from Shelley Keegan, Dr. Shelley Keegan, who's he's got the same worry in a conversation that he was having with N.T. Wright. And so we're going to play that clip, comment on it, and then we're going to share some thoughts after that video and stuff. So we do have some things planned for you guys. I think you're going to really enjoy this show. But as we sort of start out the show, Jimmy, how can we kind of like steelman this objection, make it more intelligible?
So I think that there's a rational basis to the objection in that we all do experience boredom. Even if we have something we really like, we can get bored with it. I mean, suppose your favorite thing in the world is peppermint ice cream and you eat peppermint ice cream every night. Well, after a few years of peppermint ice cream, you're likely to say, maybe I should try chocolate or something. I'm getting a little bored with this thing I used to really, really like. And so I think we can acknowledge the reality of boredom. That is part of the human experience. And it's certainly in this life. And so if we then imagine this life just going on forever, it's hard to imagine exactly how we would not get bored, especially given some of the depictions of the afterlife that we see in pop culture. Like, for example, there's a common image of people in white robes, strumming harps, sitting on clouds, worshiping God. And if you think about being in an endless church service, yeah, I could see how that gets boring. And so if you have this kind of pop culture image of an experience which a lot of people don't find entertaining anyway, and imagine it just going on forever, it's easy to see how the boredom objection could arise. In fact, I was a while back, I did a Mysterious World episode on a French freethinker named Leo Taxil, and he published a book called The Amusing Bible for Adults and Children. And because he's a freethinker, he's poking fun at Christianity. And so he had various illustrations of things that he took to be amusing, like for "Let There Be Light" from the Bible. He has an image of God as a man with a long white beard, and he's lighting his pipe by striking a match on the seat of his pants. And he took that to be amusing. He also has another image of God sitting on his throne in heaven, and he's surrounded by angels who are, or at least robed kneeling figures, who are worshiping him. And God is just looking supremely bored with all of it. And so the boredom objection is nothing new. Now, like you, I haven't ever seen it fleshed out philosophically. I've had people ask me about it over over the years, like calling in on Catholic Answers Live and stuff. But it's a real objection, and I sense the rational basis for it. Anything in this life that goes on indefinitely is something we eventually adapt to, so it ceases to be as exciting as it used to be, and eventually it can become boring. We have an instinctive sort of desire for change, a neophilia, a desire for new things that is just built into us. And there are good reasons for that, which we can talk about. But I guess I would say I understand where the objection is coming from. I don't think it ultimately succeeds, but I see where, atheists, freethinkers are coming from in posing this objection, having a rational basis.
Yeah, I suppose, and I was kind of explaining this before we went live, is that I just never really felt like the bite of this objection. Maybe it's because what it seems like the objection is based on is a sort of limit in our ability to like imagine the greatness of what heaven would be like. And so you're yeah, and what you're kind of doing is like you're drawing parallels again between like this life and the next life. And I think that there's almost too many limitations there to be like, this is a really solid objection to, belief in the afterlife, or at least our desire for an afterlife, just because there's so much that's unknown. And also, well, I think on top of that,
speaking, belief in an unlimited afterlife.
Yeah, well, actually, that brings up another point that sort of came to mind in other conversations about arguments for God's existence, like the Kalam. There's at least in popular, from someone like William Lane Craig, he defends the premise that the universe began to exist in a couple ways, a couple philosophical ways, and then some from like science and stuff. And so philosophically, one thing that he argues is that actual infinites can't exist. And so, but what's weird about this objection, to me at least, and maybe I just need to think more about it. What seems to me like one of the things that's going wrong here is that we're almost assuming with this objection that whatever is going to happen in the afterlife is going to involve some sort of limit. Like we're going to come up against like everything that we can possibly do. We're going to have done all of it, and then we're going to get bored. And what that sort of, at least one of the assumptions that seems to be embedded in there is that there is a limit in what we can do or what is possible to experience. And that seems to conflict actually with the way that a lot of atheists respond to that argument that William Lane Craig gives, that actual infinites can't exist. That's almost like a sort of tacit acceptance of that argument that Dr. Craig gives, that you can't have an actual infinite number of things. But suppose that like, even if you don't think that actual infinites are possible, you could still hold that there is at least a potential infinite of different things that could be done, different things that could be experienced. I guess that's kind of like a long-winded way of saying, I've never really felt the force behind this argument, just because, I mean, we're talking about a being who is infinite goodness, infinite love, and just perfection. And like, it seems, I don't know, it seems way too quick to assume that a being like that is omnipotent, couldn't make it the case that, we could experience amazing things forever. So I don't know. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I believe God is omnipotent enough that he can make actual infinities. And I think that from an atemporal, eternal perspective, our future actually is infinite. So I buy those premises. I also agree with you that God, being infinite, is able, and we'll get into this more later, is able to give us infinite challenges in the future. But I also sympathize with the people who make this objection, because if it's true that the next life is just an extended version of this one, maybe a little more pleasant than this one, but just an extended version of this one, then we would eventually get bored. I mean, I don't know. You said you've never felt the force of this argument particularly strongly, but maybe you just haven't been bored enough in life. In which case, congratulations to Cameron Bertuzzi. I've been bored a lot. And so I can imagine, any experience getting boring with time. But I think the argument is making, as you indicate, some crucial mistakes in its assumptions, which I don't think will apply to the next life.
Hmm. Yeah, and I suppose, I mean, this is something I haven't really like thought about until literally just this moment when you were talking. I mean, I think in boredom, there's actually like a point to boredom. You can grow in
There is.
character, in patience, right? Because of
Mhm.
you're just sitting like right now. What sort of prevents a lot of boredom these days is people being on their phones all the time. Like when you're in a situation where you're starting to get bored, you're waiting for your tires to be changed or whatever else, or you're waiting for an oil change in your car, whatever sort of situation you might be in where it would work, like in the past it would require boredom, if you didn't like bring a book with you or something like that. Nowadays you just get on your phone. But I think that like, and a lot of people are actually kind of waking up to this fact, like boredom is actually kind of a good thing. Like it's good to be bored. Yeah, at least
Yeah.
not, maybe not all the time, but like sometimes it's good to just sit there and reflect and not do anything. And that can actually grow patience, and there's even like what some people call boredom, other people call like meditation. So yeah, I don't know. I'm
If
kind of
only
like,
it was so easy.
speaking off the
I
cuff.
certainly find meditation boring. But that's just my experience. I know other people love meditation. And you're right. There is value in this life in boredom,
Hmm.
and uh, growing in patience is one of the values. But that particular growth is dependent on the negative experience of boredom. Boredom is sometimes classified as a mild form of disgust. There are certain basic emotions, and when we're bored, it's an unpleasant feeling. We're in a situation and we're kind of disgusted with it in a mild way. We wish it was more interesting. We wish it would change. And we then need to be patient and grow in patience. That is one of the things that boredom can do for us, but we don't grow if we don't find it distasteful, because then we're not bored. So it's like experiencing other evils. You can grow
Mm.
in various virtues to help you deal with situations that involve physical evils or moral evils. There are other purposes for boredom too, though, and I don't want to spoil too much of it because I know we need to get to this clip. But on the other side of the clip, I'd like to talk about the evolutionary basis of boredom and why we
Mm.
experience it, and why that is not a good guide to our experience of the afterlife.
That makes me think of something else actually. That boredom is it kind of seems like what you're saying here is that boredom involves this emotion of disgust, right? You've got
Mhm.
to have like some negative aspect of like what's going on. So you could just be sitting there, again in the tire shop, just like waiting for your tires to be changed, and you're like waiting for the next thing to happen in life, and so you're sort of disgusted with that moment. Whereas someone else who is seeing that as an opportunity, maybe to meditate or reflect or do whatever else, they're not experiencing that negative emotion, right? And
Right.
so it almost seems like
Like if you're
when it
the
comes,
engineer, if you're the engineer Montgomery Scott and you're getting your tires changed at Jiffy Lube, it's like, oh boy, I can pull up a technical manual on my phone and start reading it. He
yeah,
wouldn't be bored.
yeah. So what that kind of makes me think is that maybe actually um, the symptom of boredom here, at least like what people are sort of concerned about or worried about, might actually be a function of their perspective on things. So, like
Mhm.
in that situation, there's a number of perspectives you could take, and one of them is perspective of like disgust, like I need to get to the next thing that's sort of exciting, that's new or whatever. But you could also have the perspective of like, this is a good opportunity to just sit down, relax, and take a deep breath and recharge or whatever else. And so that could be your perspective. And in that case, since you're not experiencing that negative emotion of disgust or whatever, you wouldn't technically be bored. And so I suppose what that might mean is that in the afterlife, you don't necessarily have to experience that negative emotion of disgust,
Mhm.
because maybe your perspective in that
Mhm.
period is going to be different, right? You're going to see these opportunities, or you're going to see these periods of downtime or whatever as opportunities for reflection or opportunities for something else, some positive experience. So that may be one way to address the concern here.
Yeah. And that's one of the points that I would make in responding to this.
Nice. Okay, yeah, let's get to the clip. And before we get to the clip, actually, let me mention two quick things. So, first thing, I just recently got over the flu, so
Oh,
I may be a little bit.
They wouldn't even know that.
They wouldn't even know. Yeah, I'm kind of energetic today. I'm actually just super excited to get back to work. We just had a baby. I've taken about a month and a half off of work. Baby is amazing. Her name is Coco. Colette is her full name. And man, she is just the cutest, sweetest little baby. And we're so in love with her. It's amazing.
Babies are awesome, and they add to the substance of humanity.
Yeah, they do. And something interesting I've noticed, I know this is a little bit off topic here, but something I've noticed, I mean, this is our third child, and I noticed with the first two children, and I think this was partly because they were born so close together, I just noticed myself a lot more frustrated with those two when they were in this stage, the infancy stage. And I remember thinking like, I just really don't like the infancy stage, like as a parent. I know some people really do, and they like it when their children are that small and stuff. And I just didn't really get any enjoyment out of it. And maybe it is kind of actually related, but now with this third one, there is this age gap. And so our older children can kind of help out a little bit. I mean, it's still very minimal, but nevertheless, like our experience with this third child is radically different than the first two. It's amazing. I think part of that is because we have just grown, like both my wife and I'm noticing it from her as well. Like we've both just grown in patience and being able to, in the past, like with the first child, you know, when you go from 0 to 1, you're living this life of like, everything is kind of like about you. And when you get married, obviously they're like, you've got to split it a little bit with the other person that you're with. But then when you have a child, it's like completely just like everything gets turned upside down. Like your needs come second now. Like you've got to take care of this other like helpless human being. And that can get like, as a new parent, especially with like sleep deprivation and like the amount of care that they need, it can get kind of overwhelming.
But now after getting hit with two in quick succession is going to make that even more intense.
Exactly.
But now you and your wife have the experience of, oh, we've done this. We know what to expect now. We know we can get through it. And so you can kind of relax and enjoy the third one a little more.
Yeah, and even like the quote unquote bad parts where she's waking up in the middle of the night and crying and you know, needing milk or whatever, needing a change. It's like that kind of stuff is like just not even bothering us. It's pretty amazing. I mean, there's I think a lot more to be said about that, but I just wanted to mention that's if you guys haven't been following the channel very closely, that's where I've been. It's been amazing. I'm super excited to get back to work. This show is just one of the first shows that I've got lined up. We've got a really exciting Easter week coming up. Really exciting shows for that. But the other thing I wanted to mention,
and
go ahead
real quickly before we move on from that, if I can speak for the entire Capturing Christianity audience on behalf of all of the Capturing Christianity listeners, congratulations to you and your wife.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah. So the other thing I wanted to mention is, and I've mentioned this in the past live streams, is that we are going to be taking super chats. So if you have, this is actually an old super chat. Let me get this one off the screen. Oh, that's what it'll kind of look like. If you do have a comment or you'd like to send in a super chat and kind of help out the channel, you can do that. And we will take those throughout the stream. So we won't like just take them at the very end, kind of like we've done in the past. If you want to send in a super chat, we'll kind of pause what we're doing, address it, come back to whatever else we're talking about. So just wanted to highlight that fact. We will be honoring you guys as super chats as you help out the ministry and stuff. So with that, let's go ahead and get into the clip. Again, this is a clip between, it's a longer discussion that they had on the sort of the resurrection. It was about 9 years ago between Shelley Keegan and N.T. Wright. And this is an 11-minute clip. Whoops. It's automatically playing. Let me back this up a little bit. Okay, it's 12 minutes long. We're going to actually play the whole thing. We'll get through the whole thing in this video. But what we're going to do is, as we see fit, we may pause and comment, do whatever else we want to do as this clip is playing. But I felt like it's actually kind of important to play the whole thing because it was more conversational, but I think it was actually really interesting back and forth between the two. Like N.T. Wright actually makes some really interesting points about Christianity from a theological perspective, and then we get some really good pushback from Shelley Keegan. And by the way, if you like, if you're following apologetics, or if you've been following apologetics, you'll recognize Shelley Keegan from the debate that he did with Dr. William Lane Craig on morality. And this is one of the debates that most people think that Dr. Craig lost. In all of his debates that he's done, he's only lost, quote unquote, lost a handful of them, and a lot of people, including many Christians, think that he lost one of his debates with Shelley Keegan, this guy that's featured in this conversation with N.T. Wright. So that's probably where you're recognizing him from, if you do recognize him. All right, let's go ahead. Unless Jimmy, you've got anything else to add, let's go ahead and start the clip.
Sounds good.
As it happens, I don't. And this is going in a rather different direction. Although I'm disappointed that I will die as soon as I take it that I will die. That is, I'm lucky I'll have another 30 years, right? Maybe a bit more, 40 years. But I'm not going to have another 100 years. I'm not going to have another 200 years. I'd probably happily have another 200 years or more if I could do it in good health and have enough resources to pay the bills. On the other hand, if you were to offer me immortality, I wouldn't want it. I cannot myself conjure up an image of what life could be like that would be attractive for all eternity.
Yeah, I mean, okay, I'm going to stop it right there. So the objection from Keegan is, if you offer me immortality, I don't want it because I can't conjure up what it would be like to like want that. And to me, that's just like, how do you know that you don't want it? At least what you should say is, I don't know if I don't want it, or something along those lines. Like, maybe be agnostic about your desire to be, to gain, immortal life or whatever. So it seems like he's going sort of beyond what his actual objection would justify. Does that?
Yeah, I think that they're embedded in what he says is a helpful clue to his meaning, because you'll notice he says he wouldn't mind living for another 200 years if it was in good health and he had the resources to pay the bills, so he's not impoverished and stuff. So what he's thinking in terms of is how much suffering would shorten his desire for continued existence. He wouldn't, based on what he said, I mean, a reasonable inference is that he wouldn't want to live another 200 years if he was not in good health, if he's, racked in constant pain and bedridden and impoverished and has no money and stuff like that. He'd be suffering a lot, and that would decrease his desire to go on existing. So he imagines that, well, suppose those don't apply. Suppose I'm living I'm in good health and I've got all the resources I need to live a comfortable life. I'd like to go another 200 years. But then I assume he's imagining that another factor, another form of suffering, like boredom, would eventually set in. And that suffering from boredom would then outweigh the value he was extracting from continuing to live. And so I think I think he's making a prediction that eventually I'd get bored. I can't imagine wanting to just continue existing forever. Now, most people do, if you take out the sufferings of old age and poverty and things like that, do seem to have an intuition they want to live forever. I mean, that's one of the pitch points for Christianity. You get eternal life, and well, okay, most successful religion in world history, that seems to be a pretty good selling point. So it seems like most people do have an intuition that, provided they're not suffering and so forth, they would want to live forever as long as they're extracting value from continued existence. He just thinks that at some point the suffering of boredom would intrude to the point that he would no longer want to continue existing.
Yeah, and that raises a really interesting point about suffering and whether or not this life or any future life would be worth it given the suffering of that life. And I think a lot of atheists, and there's even an entire book that's being written on this subject by a guy named Yujin Nagasawa. It's basically, I think he titles it like The Problem of Evil for Atheists. And he basically argues that atheists are sort of optimists about this life, despite the negative experiences, the suffering in this life. But that actually doesn't make a whole lot of sense given atheism and all those sort of negative and bad things that have gone on in this life. Just mentioning the stuff related to the problem of evil, animal suffering, and all of that. It seems like that's some sort of conflict there. But the point that I want to make is that he's sort of highlighting this negative state that might exist in the afterlife, right? Boredom. That would be a sort of a kind of suffering. But in this life, I'm sure that he has not been without suffering. Yet he seems like he's still here. Seems like he's found some reason to want to continue to exist and continue to live, despite the suffering that's going on in his life. And so why not just apply the same thing to the afterlife? So suppose that in the afterlife, suppose that Christianity, maybe the view of Christianity where there is no suffering in heaven, let's suppose that that's false for a second, and that there is suffering in heaven. Why think that that type of suffering that you would experience in heaven would be outweighed by the positive things that you would experience over there? In a similar way, like in this life, right? Most people don't get to the point where they think that the suffering that they're experiencing is sort of outweighs the positive that they're experiencing, that their life is not worth living. So I don't know. It's just maybe this is just another reason why I have a hard time taking this objection too seriously. I mean, because in his life, it seems like he's got reason. Despite I'm pretty confident he's experienced some suffering. I think most of us have.
Yeah. Oh, sure.
But he nevertheless finds a reason to go on. And so why not just apply that to the afterlife?
Well, so if I'm to try to steelman his argument, if I'm thinking from his position, I'd say, sure, I've had sufferings in this life and I've gotten through them and I continue to have good experiences that counterbalance the negative ones. And so I'm extracting value from continuing to exist in this life. And I can even imagine, as he later discusses, that heaven is better than this life. And so I would extract more value. But because of the desire for new things, because of that neophilia, at some point, I would end up in a situation where the boredom I'm experiencing outweighs the value that I'm extracting from continuing to exist, whether I'm in this world or in the next one. And at that point, I wouldn't want to keep existing in the afterlife. He as we'll see as the clip goes along, he also asks N.T. Wright, so what is this great value that the afterlife is going to have for me? And he doesn't think N.T. Wright gives him a good convincing answer to that. And so he continues to feel that at some point I'd get bored enough. I just wouldn't want this anymore.
Yeah. Again, that's just like such a weird thing to think to me, because I mean, when I think about the positive things that I've experienced, when I do, there's positive experiences, there's sort of negative experiences. Maybe there's, you might call it like neutral experiences where you're just kind of, doing things that need to get done or whatever else. And it's not like you're suffering. It's just like you're getting things done or whatever in life. But it's not like, when I go and get ice cream with my family or my kids, it's not like when I go there, I'm always looking for a new flavor. Or I've got to have something else, or I'm not going to enjoy this ice cream at all. You know what I mean? It's not even worth going. Like, imagine having the mindset, I'm not even going to go get ice cream because I know that they don't have any new flavors. It's like that to me seems bonkers. Like, no, I know that they have a flavor that I like, and I'm going to go really enjoy that right now with my family. Like, go out there. My kids can play around in this little like play area and stuff, and we can go outside and enjoy some outside time and stuff. Even if they don't have new flavors, that experience that I've already had of that same thing is still worth it to me.
Well, it is up to a point, but let's try to think it through from his position. So let's modify the scenario. Suppose that the ice cream store has one flavor, vanilla. That's it. And suppose that the only thing you can do in town, the only form of entertainment that exists, is go to the ice cream store. And so after you've been going to the ice cream store every day for 15 years with your wife and your kids, and the only thing they ever serve you is vanilla, could you imagine getting to the point of, let's stay home tonight. Let's not go to the ice cream store. I think a lot of people under those limitations could. And similarly, if we compare that to like end of life experiences, I know from when my wife died that, she had been suffering tremendously, and I was suffering because of witnessing her suffer and being unable to help her. And when it finally came time for her to die, I mourned this for years, the fact that she died. I mean, I wept frequently, but still at the point where she died, I was ready for her to die and not be in this suffering anymore. And in the same way, there are people, lots of people who enjoy life and they find life worth living. And then they get to old age and they're suffering physically and they're suffering economically and they're suffering emotionally. And not because of any super tragedies, but just because things pile up. People typically aren't as robustly enjoying life when they're, say, 90 than when they're 30. And so someone gets old enough and they're suffering enough, they can say to themselves, well, I've had a good life and I'm ready to move on. I'm ready. I'm suffering enough right now. I don't want to be in this situation anymore. And essentially what he's doing in the video is projecting that into the afterlife. He's imagining if the future life is just like a continuation of this one, even if it's somewhat better, at some point, even if it's 1,000 years from now or 1,000,000 years from now, I'd get bored enough that I wouldn't want to keep existing. At least that's his intuition. If you allow these trends to play out in the future, you'd eventually get to that point.
All right, let's get back to the clip. I've got way more things that I want to comment on, but let's get back to the clip because you also have some things you want to say after we play the whole clip. So let's get
also,
back to it.
I want to criticize the next thing N.T. Wright says. So go ahead.
That's a great point. And I think if one imagines immortality as simply going on and on and on in something pretty much like the present life, even if you were guaranteed good health and enough resources and so on, that would sort of residually be odd. And I think there is something in all of us which knows, just as you kind of know at the end of a long day that however much you like reading this book or listening to this music or whatever it is, actually it's a pretty smart thing to lie down and go to sleep. So I think a lot of people, when they come to the end, the natural end of their life, I'm not talking obviously about sudden illness or car crashes or whatever, they know that it is appropriate, that it's now time to go to sleep. And there's no shame in that. There's deep sorrow, of course, for people grieving. Just wanted to go back to the watch for a minute, because that's an interesting example. And of course, the famous old line about grandfather's old axe that in the last 20 years has had 2 new handles and 3 new blades. Is it the same axe, even though every single part has been replaced? And so I fully understand there is that question of continuity. But I think...
real quick, this part of the conversation is actually related to something earlier that they were talking about in the full video. So didn't have time to actually cut it out. I was just going to play like the original like YouTube video, but the audio was super, super low. So it would have just kind of not played well on this live stream. So I cut it out, but I didn't have enough time to cut out this section that's not strictly relevant to the subject for today. But I just did want to highlight that because
did you cut out the part where N.T. Wright talks about immortality and what it means?
No, I don't think he's gotten to that yet.
Oh, okay. I thought that was the next thing he was going to say.
Yeah, maybe he gets to it in a second here. Let's just keep playing.
Okay. When you were talking about if I believe in a big, powerful God who can do this, one of the really strange things about the Christian faith is that though the being we call God is in some sense or other omnipotent, the nature of power itself has been redefined around Jesus. In the New Testament, power is not about sending in the tanks and blasting everything out of the way. It's about love and about self-giving love and about the love we see when Jesus dies on the cross. And the whole New Testament really is about rethinking what we mean by power and rethinking what we mean by God's power. And that's why if we simply have a big, strong God who can do whatever he likes, then, okay, that metaphysically does sort of sweep other options off the board or give one carte blanche to invent all sorts of things. But if you have power redefined as the power of self-giving, creative love, healing love, then it seems to me that gives you more of a way in to talk about a real hope, a real future.
I don't actually see it. It won't surprise you to hear. I mean, I like love, right? I mentioned love in my opening remarks as something that I think is important. But adding the word love doesn't make the mystery go away.
No,
It may
of course
give you
not.
reason to be more hopeful. God loves us, and so, given that I believe in God's omniscience, omnipotence, if he cares for us, if there's a way, he will do it. But that doesn't make it any clearer what it is that needs to be done to allow identity to continue across these kinds of gaps. And to say God loves us just adds another word, doesn't clear up the mystery. But what I really want to hear about, though, is what's your image of immortality? What can you say about what kind of life you hope for, what kind of existence you hope for that would really be desirable forever?
Yeah.
See, here's where they get back to the point of immortality and stuff. Whereas before they were talking about identity over time.
Right. And that's something that I think N.T. Wright, now it may make sense if you watch what preceded this, but in context of this clip, I think it's apologetically a mistake to get off the main topic, because Kagan has posed this question, why would I want to continue existing forever? What could possibly incentivize me to do that? Why wouldn't I eventually get bored at some point and want to cease existing? And Wright has some very interesting things to say that are very profound and that could be further explored. But in this context, they're a distraction. One of them that we didn't see is after they initially broached this question, and this might actually be before this clip started, when Kagan says, why would I want to be immortal? Immediately, N.T. Wright, or at least my memory is, immediately N.T. Wright goes into a big discussion about how immortality involves being in a body. And what he's trying to do is correct the idea that we exist forever as ghosts, as if we're not going to be resurrected. And he thinks that that in many people's minds, or in most people's minds, immortality conjures this ghostly existence instead of a re-embodied existence. And that's true, and I correct that misunderstanding sometimes myself, but I thought he went on too long about it, and it took us away from the actual question that's being asked. But here, Kagan has reposed it and now put it in the form of, so what's you talk about love, and I like love, but it doesn't really answer the question, what is it exactly for him? It doesn't, he doesn't know why I wouldn't get bored with that too. So what is it exactly that you would say is going to entertain me forever enough to want to continue to exist?
I wouldn't use the word immortality as the main descriptor for that future life, because I do think that so many people, when they use it in a sense which borrows particularly from Plato, the idea of an immortal soul which existed before time, existed before I was conceived, and will go on existing whether I want it to or not. I don't believe in that, and the New Testament doesn't actually teach that, to many people's surprise. But what we are promised in the New Testament is immortality as a gift, but it's an immortal physicality. People find that very difficult, because when people talk about immortality, usually they mean a disembodied immortality of the soul or whatever. And so in arguing for new creation and resurrection, I'm talking about a life beyond death, which will be a new life that death can't touch. Now, so that gets us onto the stage, as it were.
Do you want to comment on
that was what I was responding to. My memory had it dislocated. So like Billy Pilgrim, I had become unstuck in time.
Yeah. So, I mean, it seems like you could just hold that there's a plethora of views about the afterlife, and especially about anthropology, what actually makes up humans. So you could be a dualist. You could be a dualist, interactionist, or a hylomorphist. What are they called? Hylomorphism? Hylomorphic dualist? Is that the right term?
Sure.
Yeah, work. You could just hold that there is a sort of immaterial substance that we are souls. We have these physical bodies, and we will have a physical body in the afterlife and stuff. And so there's a bunch of different views that you could hold. But yeah, let's move on.
Hopefully now he gets to the actual answer after that detour.
Yeah.
What will that be like? We don't have any great descriptions of it, except that in Jesus himself, what we see is this strange, in biblical language, coming together of heaven and earth. And this is something which I think it's a deeply Jewish worldview, that over against the Stoics, who collapse heaven and earth together straight away, as it were, and say that's where we are all the time, and over against the Epicureans, who push them as far apart as they can, so that then the world and the atoms do their own thing here, and if there's a heaven, it's a long way away. In the Jewish and biblical worldview, which comes through into the Christian worldview, heaven and earth kind of mysteriously overlap. And the overlap can be seen in certain key moments, in certain memories, in certain hopes, in certain texts, and then supremely, the Christians say, in Jesus himself. And this generates a different kind of metaphysic, it seems to me, where God's space and our space really do come together in Jesus. And that's what then generates a new sort of life, which in the Gospels, in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the books about Jesus in the New Testament, we see all sorts of new possibilities. We see life being given a whole new color, a whole new shape, a whole new dimension. And those are seen as pointers to the new creation, how it will be. And if we stop and think, do I just want to go on and on and on doing the same things over and over again to all eternity, then yeah, that can seem pretty boring. The English novelist Julian Barnes wrote a book, The History of the World, in 10.5 chapters.
I love that, chapter.
It's a great book. And at the end, he has this character who goes to a sort of vaguely heavenly place, and he gets bored and eventually asks to go back, including, I think, playing golf a few times, and the first time he gets 1 hole in one, and the second time he gets 2 holes in one, and by the end of the week he's going around the golf course in 18 strokes, and he's bored, as you would be. I wouldn't mind doing it just once, but that, it seems to me, ignores what we know, if you take Jesus seriously, what we know about God as creator and recreator, that there are infinite possibilities, just as there are infinite things going on in God's world in terms of the vastness of space, the tiny flowers, etc. So God is into all that infinite beauty, power, delight, and the role of humans in that is not simply...
So you see what Wright is doing here. He's talking about some very interesting, profound things, but up to right now, he hasn't really engaged the question. He talked a lot about different worldviews and how they relate, the physical and the non-physical worlds. He talked he talked about how he sympathizes with the objection, and that's good. You need to show the person you're debating that you understand their position and you take it seriously. And so he talked about, he could see if we just did the same thing over and over again, that could get boring. So he sympathized, but then he finally makes the point that you made before we started watching the video, that God is infinite and has infinite stuff for us to do. And so now he's finally gotten kind of the nugget, or one of the key nuggets on the table that can actually help answer the question.
Yeah, and I what I was reflecting on as we were playing this clip, and it hadn't really occurred to me until watching it back again, is what we're seeing is that Keegan is a trained philosopher, whereas N.T. Wright is a trained theologian, New Testament scholar. Mm-hmm. So I think the way that they're approaching these questions, because Keegan's question is very philosophical in nature. And so it makes a lot of sense that N.T. Wright would pull on his background of New Testament scholarship to be like, okay, yeah, but the new heaven and the new earth are going to come together and stuff. And so he's going to mention that, although that doesn't really shed a whole lot of light on what Keegan is really after. And so, but eventually they do start to speak the same language, like you mentioned here, where he mentions the infinite possibilities and God being infinite and stuff. So, but I just, that did occur to me that the two of them do what?
You're very charitable explaining N.T. Wright's digressions in that way.
I really do think that that's what's behind it, is that they're kind of speaking different languages. Keegan is narrowing in as an analytic philosopher. Hey, I want to figure out this one problem. Give me a solution to this one problem. And N.T. Wright more approaching it from a poetic kind of standpoint, poetic only in the sense of he's coming at it from the perspective of a New Testament scholar. And so he's going to use some theological language.
Yeah, he's approaching it from the perspective of a New Testament scholar who has unlimited word count and can write 750-page books.
Yeah. Okay, let's continue with N.T. Wright's response. I think he's almost finished here.
To be spectators, but to be participants, to be co-creators.
It seems to me that the answer you've given, boiled down to its essence, says there's a set of experiences and goods that we're familiar with in this life, and having those forever, that would be dreadful. So you don't want that. And then when I ask you, okay, what will it be like? You tell me, well, there'll be new color, new sounds, new whatever it is, and that's just metaphor, which means, taken literally, your answer just boils down to, there'll be something, I have no idea what it's like, I cannot begin to describe it, but I promise you it'll be worth wanting forever. Now, if you believe that because you think that your New Testament tells you that, so be it. But you can understand why I, sitting here, being told, yes, there's something worth having forever, I have no idea what it's like, this doesn't give me any reassurances.
No, I can see that. If you
This actually is the way that Keegan interacts with NT right here is kind of endearing to me. Like it makes me really, like him.
Yeah. He's trying to sympathize with N.T. Wright's position while maintaining his own, and this is a very convivial discussion. So I like this. I think this is the way that debates like this should be done.
Yeah, and it's actually one of the reasons why I wanted to play the full clip, because I mean, if you guys have been watching this, we've already gone through 8 minutes, and this is like, normally the clips that we play are way shorter. So this is just really enjoyable. So we've got about another 3 minutes 47 seconds of this clip, but let's continue playing and listening.
If you take, again, I'll come back to it. If you take Jesus out of the picture, most of this, if not all of this, is going to fall apart.
Put Jesus in the picture, but then we're just back to what we had earlier, namely, I asked you, how are we going to have life after death? And you said, I don't know, but God can do it. I ask you, why is this life, eternal life, going to be worth having? And you say, I don't know, but Jesus is going to make it so.
No. Slight oversimplification, I think. That's actually a British understatement. We do that.
Actually, can we pause it a second? So I think Kagan did something really good, and then he did something really bad. The thing he did really good was steel man N.T. Wright's position, because N.T. Wright was starting to say, if you take Jesus out of all this belief about the afterlife, then a lot of what I'm saying will, not hang together well. And Kagan at that point intervened to steelman the argument by saying, oh no, keep Jesus in it. I'm willing to grant Jesus is the Son of God and all this stuff. I grant all Christianity is true. Why should I still want eternal life? Why would that be attractive to me? So that steel manning by Kagan was good, but then he immediately turned around and straw manned what N.T. Wright was saying by characterizing it as, well, you assure me there's something and you don't really know what it is, you and so forth, but it's going to make it all worth it. And actually, that's not what N.T. Wright was in the process of saying. Now, I can understand if Kagan missed it because N.T. Wright is not being as clear about his points as he might be, but he already mentioned that God has infinite stuff for us to do, and that's stuff that can keep us interested. So we won't run out of boredom. We won't enter terminal boredom because of a lack of interesting new things. And so I appreciate that Kagan steelmanned N.T. Wright's position, but then he turned right around and strawmanned it.
All right, yeah, let's continue.
The thing that makes it worthwhile is love, and love isn't just a word which is tossed into the mix as another vague metaphor. It's actually an extremely powerful word, like the word forgiveness is an extremely powerful word. Forgiveness isn't just, okay, back to square one. Forgiveness generates new possibilities. It opens up new ways of looking at the world, at your neighbor, at yourself, at God. And so when I say that I don't have an advanced photograph or video camera of what it's actually going to be like.
By the way, if you're listening to this in your car, that is actually like sirens in the video. So it's not sirens outside of your car.
I'm not just waving my arms around and saying, it'll be nice, trust me, or trust God, or something. I'm saying because in Jesus we discover a kind of depth of love which seems to grasp us and hold us and direct us and assure us, then that gives us a platform. Now, okay, you might say, that's very nice if you've got it, but if you haven't, you haven't, except that Jesus actually is a real person who was right there in the middle of history.
And then it's not the historicity of Jesus that I'm worried about. It's the weight you're putting on love. Because now it seems to me you want to have it two different ways. You want to say, all right, this is something we're familiar with. The reason you're not just hand-waving is because we've got an experience of love as something that creates new possibilities, invites us forward and makes us want to continue. But of course, earlier you said, well, if we had more of the same that we're familiar with here on Earth, that really would get dreadful and would get boring. And so what you're saying is, it's going to be like love in that we know that it's worth having, but it's not going to be like love because it isn't something that would ever grow tiring after a million, billion, trillion, billion, gazillion years.
I didn't say that about love. You see, one of the interesting points there, again, sorry to quote the New Testament to my sort of field, is that love is supposedly, according to St. Paul, one of the three things that will actually last. He says lots of other things will fall away, but actually there are three things: faith, hope, and love, which is interesting because you might have thought, why hope? Surely when we're there won't be anything to hope for. But that tells me right there when he says that faith and hope and love last, that they are actually qualities we can know and experience in the present, which will actually characterize our experience in the future. And the idea of hope being something which will also characterize us in the future indicates to me that it won't just be an endless going around the same circle. It will actually be a world full of new possibilities in which our creative, loving personalities will be able to contribute materially, and I mean materially, to things that will be so in God's new world. So that these are hints and guesses, but I think they are strong, sure signposts.
The language of new possibilities seems to be, once again, just another word for mystery. There'll be something worth having. It's not like what we've got now, but it's worth having.
Okay. Thank you.
I actually really like that last part from the moderator, too. She's like, all right, let's move on.
Let's move on. Yeah.
But I think that was a good exchange. But what do you think about Keegan's last response? Because he does tries to make the point, and he makes it a couple different ways of really what's going on is there's more possibilities that you're not really taking into consideration. There's new stuff that God could create. But then what Keegan says at the very end is he's like, well, what that sounds like you're saying when you say that there's new possibilities is there's just this mystery out there, this mystery stuff that we're going to be able to do, and that doesn't really remove the mystery in his mind. So what is your response to that kind of thought?
I would say that he's engaging in a debater's tactic where he's using prejudicial language to make his opponent's position look bad. He says, you talk to me about all this different stuff, and what that really says to me is it's a mystery. And that makes it sound like it's an inadequate answer. To pose it as it's just a mystery. And actually, N.T. Wright, I think you could say it better and clearer, but is saying it more than that. Now, there is an element of mystery here, and I think we should be upfront about that. We don't know exactly what the things are that will make eternal life worth living, but we can still rationally believe that eternal life will be worth living, even without being able to predict those in specificity. It's like if you have a small child who's not an adult yet, doesn't know the realities of adult life, doesn't know about things like what it's like to be married, or what it's like to have marital congress, or what it's like to have your own children, or doesn't know about the satisfactions from watching an awesome movie, or whatever your adult hobby happens to be, reading Greek poetry or whatever it may be. A little kid can say, well, why won't I get bored with life by the time I'm 30? And the parent can say, don't worry, there's going to be plenty of fun stuff in life when you get there. And even if
they can't specify exactly what it's going to be, that's going to keep them entertained.
Right, because the kid can't even understand, well, why would I want to read Greek poetry? How is that going to make it better? Or, watching an R-rated movie that's tense and drama like Saving Private Ryan or something. The kid can't even understand what the adult could say, but it can still be rational for the kid to say, well, I trust my parent, and my parent says that there's going to be stuff to make continuing to want to live at age 30 worth living, making life worth living at that age. And in the same way, we can have a rational basis for saying that, yeah, there's mystery to exactly what is going to make it worth living, but God assures us that that will be there, and we can trust him, and therefore we can have a rational basis for concluding that we won't get bored. So
yeah, and it seems like
Mhm.
it seems like there's way more reason to think that if God does exist, right? It seems like there's way more reason to think that there's a lot more of stuff that's possible given that God exists than there is to think that if God exists, what we see now is the only stuff that's possible, right? Or something similar to what we see now is really what's possible. Seems like we're dealing with an infinite God. I mean, if we're thinking about just the way that I've had this intuition since I was like a little kid. I look around at the world, I'm like, this is a really weird thing to exist. This universe, this earth, the moon, like this is just weird. Like the way that why is this the stuff that exists as opposed to something else? It seems like there's just so much more that could have existed, and this is just what happens to exist. It just seems kind of strange. And so I've kind of had this intuition that there's so much more that's possible. But then you add God into the mixture of like, this is an infinite, omnipotent being that is omniscient, that knows everything, every possibility. Seems like you've got, in that situation, you've got the resources to generate the expectation of like, there are a lot of possibilities that we're not aware of, that God in his infinite knowledge and wisdom and power would be aware of and would be able to actualize. And it seems like the safest bet in that case would be on the side of, okay, it seems actually pretty plausible that there's a lot more that could go on in the afterlife given God exists than there would be to think, oh, we're just going to be bored. Like it's going to be inevitable. Like that seems a lot more on shaky ground, that intuition.
In fact, if the Christian claim is true that God is an infinite being, then his mystery is infinite and infinitely transcends our finite intellects. And that means that no matter how much God has already revealed about himself, there is still an infinite amount to discover. And the only way we could the only way to exhaust that would be taking an infinite amount of time. And really, you can't exhaust the infinite. So God has enough mystery about himself alone, apart from the created world, to make it interesting for us forever. But there are a series of points that I would like to make if I can.
Let's do it.
Because unlike N.T. Wright, I am trained as an analytic philosopher. And so here's how I would approach the objection. So if someone says to me, why won't I get bored with eternal life? I would say a few things. Point one, if I totally understand the objection, we do get bored in this life. And if you just played this life forward, even if you gave it an upgrade so it's a happier place, you could get bored eventually. I wouldn't want to be in an endless church service, at least even if it's jazzier than a lot of the church services I've been in. I would get bored with that, sitting around on clouds, stroking a harp. I would get bored with that. So I totally understand that. But notice what the objection is presupposing. It's presupposing that our next life is maybe a slightly upgraded continuation of this one. It's not modified in any fundamental way. But if it's modified in a fundamental way, then the boredom that we experience in this life may not apply to it. And to give an example of that, even in this life, I would point to a phenomenon known as brain stimulation reward. Brain stimulation reward occurs in a variety of contexts, such as electrically stimulating the pleasure centers in an organism's brain. You can also do it with drugs, but it's been tested with like lab mice. And if you stimulate the lateral hypothalamus, among other areas, in a lab mouse's brain, and you let it press a lever to trigger the brain stimulation reward it's getting, it will press that lever forever and ever and ever until it dies. Because that's something that is so compelling, that direct brain stimulation reward, that the organisms that experience it will, unless you artificially restrict their ability to get that reward, they will just pursue that reward until they die. They won't care about food, they won't care about sex, they won't care about anything else. They want that stimulation. So that shows us that even in this life, the boredom reflex can be overcome by sufficient reward. And so if we can see that the boredom response can be overcome in this life by sufficient reward, then there's no reason the boredom reflex can't be overcome in the next life by sufficient reward. So let's think about boredom itself. Why do we have it? Well, it actually has an evolutionary goal. There is selection pressure on our kind of organism to get bored, because our ancestors grew up in a world of scarcity, where there was not so much food, there were not so many mates available, there was limited territory, limited good water, there was a bunch of limitations. And if you are just content with your current situation, you're not going to go find the new good spring of water that's over the hill. You're not going to find the new good hunting ground. You're not going to find the new possible person of the opposite sex to mate with and pass on your genes. And so there's selection pressure on organisms of our kind to get bored with a current environment that's not changing. That neophilia we have is designed to motivate us to go out and conquer new challenges and get new resources and new things that will help us survive and reproduce. And so that's why we have boredom as a species. Now, it also can, as we said earlier, help us grow in patience, but it also has a direct evolutionary benefit. That's why we get fidgety when things don't change enough. It's because our genes are telling us, go out and get more resources, go out and make things better, go out and find things that will enable you to survive and reproduce. And so there's an evolutionary function to boredom. But here's the next point. If we're in the afterlife, we're not in a situation where we need to survive and reproduce. We're already dead. So evolutionary considerations don't apply in the afterlife. You don't need to go find new food to survive, or new fresh water to survive, or worry about, a hostile tribe invading, because we're already dead. And so evolutionary factors one would expect not to follow us. So the boredom reflex that we have is something we would expect to be offline in the afterlife. We won't get bored because we don't need to get bored, because we don't need to be motivated to survive and reproduce. So boredom would have no evolutionary function for us in the afterlife, and you can't expect evolutionary functions to persist when they have no purpose. So that would be the next point I would make. I also would point out that, and N.T. Wright touched on this, but I think he could have explored it a little bit more.
Let me say before you get to the third
Sure.
one, I just wanted to say that I was actually, hit my microphone. I was thinking about the first point that you made about the reward centers in your brain. I've done some research, minimal, but some research into the reward centers in the brain, like dopamine and serotonin and stuff, and sort of the reason why we do sort of anything that we do. And dopamine plays a large part, but the way that the neurology is structured in our brain, I mean, that was something that I was thinking about too, was that we're sort of assuming that the same sort of reward pathways that exist now would be the same pathways that exist in the afterlife. And there's not a whole lot of reason to think that those would be sort of one for one, or that the same way that they would act now would be the same way that they would react over there. And I think one of the reasons for thinking that is that there's a lot of people that in this life experience anxiety and depression, but a lot of that can be not necessarily cured, but a lot of that can be mitigated through the use of pharmaceuticals, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what that does, it literally just changes your brain chemistry, how things operate, your serotonin levels, your dopamine levels, and so we know that altering brain chemistry can have a tremendous impact on the way that we feel and our mental health and all those sorts of things. And so it just seems pretty obvious that the structure of the brain or the structure of the neurology or whatever it is, that the way that it's going to operate in the new heaven and the new earth, seems like there could be enough changes to where the questions of boredom and stuff would be completely mitigated to the point of being non-existent. So I kind of had that thought too about the stimulating the reward centers and how all that's going to work. So that was the only point I was going to make on that first thing that you said.
Okay. Another thing, and as I was saying, Inti got into this a little bit, but I think he could have nailed it home, is God being infinite and God being love. God is infinite love. And if even rats in this life will press a lever until they die to get electrical stimulation in their lateral hypothalamus, being in contact with a source of infinite love, that's an even greater reward. And so if rats don't get bored with electrical stimulation, I'd propose humans won't get bored with intimate, eternal contact with an infinite source of love. And so I think that's another reason to see us as not getting bored, because of the spiritual union we'll have with God. If even electrical stimulation or certain drugs can overwhelm a person's desire for self-preservation and can overwhelm their boredom response, then contact with infinite love will do it too. Then there's another point which N.T. Wright also began to explore a little bit, and that's that we're going to have stuff to do. It's not like we're going to be doped up zombies just basking in the glow of God. The vision of the afterlife that biblical revelation presents to us, not the book of Revelation specifically, although it does, but throughout the New Testament, we're presented with a vision of the afterlife where we're going to be doing stuff. Where it talks in multiple passages about us reigning with Christ. And if you're reigning, it also talks about us judging various things. If you're reigning things, if you're judging things, those are administrative things. That's stuff to do. And so it appears from biblical revelation, we're not just going to be, barnacles on the clouds of heaven sitting there doing nothing. We're going to have tasks. We're going to have things to accomplish. We're going to have goals. We're going to have activities. And consequently, since God, as we mentioned, is infinite, he can have infinite stuff for us to do. And we thus wouldn't get bored with it, because there will always be new challenges, or at least we may reasonably suppose that there will be new challenges, given that God has indicated this eternal life will be pleasurable. Two final points. One final point is, but they're connected. One of them is we actually have a form of evidence for this in deathbed experiences, near-death experiences, and after-death communications. One of the things that all three of these, so a deathbed experience is like someone is dying, they're on their bed, they're going to die, and they have a vision of deceased relatives or angels welcoming them into the afterlife, and they get a glimpse of what the afterlife is going to be like. A near-death experience is one where they actually get up to the point of dying and may even cross it. They may go into cardiac arrest, their heart may stop. They can then have an out-of-body experience where they meet the deceased relatives, they see this next realm where they're going to be living. And then after-death communications are ones where the person has died, and then their loved ones who are still alive here on earth report having experiences of them. They may appear to them visually and talk to them audibly and tell them, don't worry about me, everything is great here. And one of the things that is consistent throughout these, through the pre-death deathbed experiences, through the near-death experiences, and through the after-death communications, is a consistent emphasis on how awesome the next world is and how happy the descendants are to be in it, or happy to be going to it. And they talk about having an understanding of why things happen the way they do and how their sufferings on earth actually played a purpose and they're okay with it. And they are experiencing tremendous joy and love and a sense of reward in the afterlife. So we actually have empirical evidence that there is a major upgrade. Now, that doesn't show us, because after death experiences tend to occur, most of them are shortly after death, although they can occur decades later. So we don't have evidence that they're not going to be bored a million years from now. That's not what this evidence shows. But what it does show is a sudden dramatic sense of joy and love and pleasure and understanding, and that's consistent with the picture we have of from biblical revelation of eternal life being something we're not going to get bored with. Also, another thing that comes through from these experiences, the same experiences, is that the perception of time is different in the afterlife, that it doesn't seem to mean what it does here on earth. When people are in this afterlife state, they report time not functioning like it does here. They report it kind of like a day is like 1,000 years, 1,000 years is like a day. And if our perception of time is fundamentally different, that's another reason we're not going to get bored. Because what happens when we get bored is we've had a lengthy perception of uninteresting activity that leads to the state of boredom. So I would say, in addition to the philosophical and theological arguments we've covered, we also have empirical data from deathbed experiences, near-death experiences, and after-death communications that there is a big upgrade in the afterlife, and that that time is perceived differently. And all of those are reasons I would point to for, even if I can't tell you exactly what the specifics of why you're going to be interested in the afterlife, I can give you good reason that there is a grounded reason to believe that you're not going to get bored.
All right, let's do this. Let's turn to some questions from the audience. We haven't had any super chat sent in, but I have been keeping an eye on the live chat. I've got a couple here that we can begin to address. So one of them is from Brian Stevens. He says, "What are these heaven tasks? What are the consequences for not doing them?"
Well, the two tasks that we've been told about are reigning, and the word that's in Greek, it's based on the word basileus, which means king. And it's got the verb form has a sun stuck on the front of it, which is basically like co in English. So we're going to be co-kings with Jesus. So if you imagine the kind of tasks that kings perform when they reign, we're going to be doing something like that. The other task, and this fits under what kings do, is judge, because in the ancient world, kings were the supreme judges of the land. And we're told at various points that judging is going to be one of the things we do. Paul tells us we're going to judge angels. Jesus tells the 12 disciples they're going to sit on 12 thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. So now judge in our culture tends to mean passing legal sentences, and that may be part of what's going on here. But the biblical concept of judging can be a little broader, and it's more of a leadership role, like the judges who governed Israel before the United Monarchy. So what we're given to understand is we're going to have tasks that are analogous to those of rulers. That leaves open, what are we going to be ruling over? Although angels, it gets mentioned as one possibility. In terms of penalties for not doing them, well, I would say this is going to be hypothetical. Hypothetically, if God's given you an assignment and you say, "Oh, forget that, I'm not doing that," well, then you're liable for judgment yourself. Hypothetically, if you disobey God in a grave matter, knowingly and deliberately, you're turning your back on God, you're casting yourself out of his presence. And so if someone chose not to do the tasks God assigned them, then I would suppose that person could go to hell. But I don't think that's going to happen, because for the saved, they're confirmed in a state of holiness, and they wouldn't want to disobey God. They would get fulfillment from obeying God.
So Brian actually did send in a super chat. He says, "Thanks for taking questions. I disagree with you, but I appreciate your channel and that you promote freedom of speech and discussion." So I appreciate that, Brian. He did have another question here. Yeah, and I think it's actually related to what you were just talking about. He said, if one day in heaven we decide we don't want to be there anymore, would God let us leave heaven?
Well, I would say yes. God doesn't force his presence on anyone. He, even in this life, he lets us choose for him or against him. So if someone was in heaven and said, I don't want to be here anymore, I don't think God would restrain them. And heaven in this case should not be understood as a cloudy realm where we don't have bodies. We're going to, in the Christian vision, we're going to be living on the new earth. We're going to have bodies. Hell is, in that case, is better understood as spiritual disunion with God, cutting yourself off from the source of all joy in life. And so, so with that understanding, I would say if someone chose to go to hell, they could choose to go to hell. But I don't think anybody's going to do that, because I think we're going to be confirmed in holiness and love.
Yeah. There was actually an analogy that's it's not a very nice analogy that I've heard in the past, but there's a reason why no one in their right mind goes and actively seeks out feces to go eat. You know what I mean? It's
Sure.
there's stuff that we
I've
avoid.
never done that. Yeah.
Never done that.
Agreed.
Never planned to do that. But there's a reason why we don't seek out that sort of behavior, right? And the parallel would be, it'd be worse than that to go and try to remove yourself from God's presence. So that's the analogy that I've heard. But let's move on to another question from Calvin Withune. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly. He says, in a nutshell, he's sort of laying out what his objection to heaven is, and the way that he articulates it. Sorry, I've got my eyes itchy for some reason. So he says, in a nutshell, regardless of what life is like across eternity, if I am still fundamentally me, I am such now that I will grow bored given enough time. I'd have to be altered.
Okay, and framing that in context of what I said, you could look at it a couple of different ways. You could say, well, you will be altered, but not in your fundamental identity. Just like if I let's say I get gangrene in my arm, and they have to cut off my arm. Well, I'm still Jimmy Akin. My fundamental identity hasn't been altered, but my circumstances are altered now. I no longer have my right arm. I think it's the same kind of thing here. In the afterlife, you're not going to need to strive to survive and reproduce. Therefore, your survival and reproductive instincts, which drive boredom, will be offline. Jesus already told us our reproductive instincts are going to be offline in heaven. And I think the same thing is going to be true of our survival instincts. We're not going to need to survive. And so to strive to survive, we're going to be guaranteed eternal life. And so boredom will not be applicable to our situation. You'll still be you, but there has been a transformation, at least in your situation. Also, you will be in an environment where you have access to infinite love. And for reasons we covered, that's going to be superior to constant electrical stimulation to the pleasure centers of your brain. And so consequently, you would expect not to get bored with intimate union with infinite love.
All right, let's move to a question from a super chat from Ryan Gasling, not to be confused with Ryan Gosling. Is there any objection to defining heaven as a synonym for, quote, the best of all possible worlds? Also, how can we steelman the case for love in heaven? Thank you.
Okay, there is an objection to defining heaven as the best of all possible worlds, because that presupposes there is a best possible world. But as the Catechism of the Catholic Church points out, among other philosophers from other Christian traditions, God could always make something better. He could always create a greater amount of goodness than he had in the world than he has in fact created. So there isn't a best of all possible worlds. I think a better definition for heaven would be that it's a purely good world. In terms of steel manning the case for love in heaven, I'm not sure. I'd need to know what objection is being posed to the idea of love in heaven in order to steel man the case for it. But we're told in biblical revelation that God is love. And so that God is in heaven, God is love, therefore there is love in heaven. It seems fairly straightforward to me.
I did also want to highlight in it may also not be worth mentioning just because I don't have the specifics, but there are some philosophers who are defending the claim that this is actually the best of all possible worlds, and it's actually the multiverse. And so there are some theists. I know Gavin Kerr, I think, is one of them. If I'm remembering correctly, he's one of the theist philosophers who is arguing for a view like this. So I think most philosophers agree with Jimmy that there is no best of all possible worlds. There's no best. You could always add like one more valuable thing. So there is no like limit. But there are some people who think that, well, the multiverse exists, every possible world exists, and so that would be, I guess, their view. But yeah, I just wanted to highlight the fact that some people, some theists do think that there is a best of all possible worlds, and this is that one. It'd
be interesting to see their arguments and debate them.
Yeah. That would actually be a fun show. So actually remind me after the show, and we can maybe set something up. That'd be fun.
Okay.
All right. We did have another super chat from Calvin. It looks like he's just saying, he said, I asked in the live chat what his issue was, because he was mentioning in the live chat that his objection, his particular form of the objection, the boring heaven objection, wasn't addressed. And so I asked him what it was, and now he's saying thanks for addressing his comment. So thanks for sending in a super chat, Calvin. All right, let's get to, I think, one more question, and then we'll kind of close out the stream here. From JB, is there a possibility that people in purgatory will be able to see/interact with people in heaven? Somewhat related to the topic, but a little bit tangential, but maybe you can kind of shed light on this.
Well,
give some thoughts.
It's going to depend on one's theological commitments. I mean, various Christians in the Protestant community, most of them don't believe that there even is a purgatory. But speaking from a tradition that acknowledges the existence of, there is a final purification that, if God hasn't made us completely holy by the time we die, he will make us completely holy before we get into heaven. So we won't be tempted to sin, and we won't be sinning in heaven. So there would need to be a final purification, whether it takes time or happens instantly. People who are experiencing that purification, to the extent it takes any time, there's no reason in principle they can't interact with people who are already fully purified and in heaven. Again, not thinking of heaven as if it's a spatial location, but as a condition where you've been rendered perfectly holy and you're now in full spiritual communion with God. Well, we have people here on earth who have different levels of holiness, who nevertheless interact with each other. And so if someone is at a higher stage of purification than we are, let's say they're in purgatory, and someone else is even higher, they're in heaven, then I see no reason why they can't interact. And in fact, there are reports of individuals interacting whose journey is complete and whose journey is yet incomplete. We do have, reports of that kind of interaction happening in the literature.
All right. I think that's going to do it for us in this live stream. We actually did plan on going about 90 minutes, and we're about at that time limit. So this was actually a lot of fun. I'm really glad that we were able to address this topic. Again, we haven't talked about this one yet, but it was a great show to get back to work with. And I'm really glad that I was able to share it with you, Jimmy. So thanks for coming on.
My pleasure.
To talk with me about this. All right. Is there anything that you'd like to leave with the audience? Maybe if they're coming across your work for the first time, where can they find more stuff?
Yeah. So I'm an apologist for Catholic Answers. Our website is Catholic.com, and we've got tens of thousands of resources online for free for people. I also regularly appear on our radio show, Catholic Answers Live, which is on more than 300 stations, and I answer questions on all kinds of topics. My personal website is jimmyakin.com, and that's kind of a hub for most of my online activity. I'm also known for being on various podcasts, the most famous of which is Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. It's in all the standard podcast directories, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, all those things. It's also at mysterious.fm, like FM radio. And every Friday, I look at mysterious subjects from the twin perspectives of faith and reason. We lay out the background for the mystery. Then we say, okay, what would reason tell us about this? And what would the faith tell us about it? Recently, I did an episode on after-death communications, which I mentioned. So you can go listen to that after-death communications episode. And coming up next month, I have a two-part, the one I did recently, it was in first week of January, was negative near-death experiences, where people, you often hear about how joyous and blissful it is in near-death experiences, but about a fifth of people who have them report it not being so joyous and blissful. And so there's been a lot of new study on negative near-death experiences. I talk about that. Next month, I have a two-parter coming up about after-death communications, which, according to recent studies, 40 to 50% of the population reports being contacted in one way or another by their departed loved ones at some point during life. So this is an extremely common phenomenon, and we're going to be talking about it next month.
Nice. Yeah, and I highly recommend that you guys go check out his other work. If anything that you heard today interests you, go check out, especially Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. That's one of my favorite new podcasts that I listen to. So, but again, Jimmy, thanks for coming on. Thank you guys for watching. See you in the next episode. Again, I've got some really exciting stuff planned. So if you'd like to subscribe and support the channel, you can go to our Patreon linked in the description, or you can subscribe for free and support us that way. But I appreciate you guys watching. We'll see you guys soon. Hey, it's me again. Actually, don't leave yet. I've got something super, super important to tell you. So first of all, you're awesome. Like you just watched a really, really long video just now, and you're still watching it. That is actually pretty amazing. Secondly, we have hundreds, literally hundreds of other apologetics related videos for you to watch on our channel. Go check them out. I've interviewed exorcists, hosted debates between Christians and atheists. I've even made response videos to atheists. All of that is available on our channel. Go check it out. Third, I rely on people that see value in my work, people like you that watch videos to the very end, to keep the lights on around here. Literally, this is how I feed my family. So if you see value in the work that I do, please consider supporting this ministry and becoming a patron. Links to that are in the description. Oh, and have I mentioned that Christianity is true?